My husband told me he'd only consider having children with me if I quit my job and learned to be like his mother. After 7 years of marriage, Daniel dropped this bomb during our anniversary dinner. His mother spent 40 years serving his father breakfast in bed, ironing his underwear, and asking permission to visit her own sister. That's the woman I needed to become if I wanted to be worthy of carrying his children. I'm a software architect making twice his salary, but apparently that made me less of a woman in his eyes. The thing is, when we met, Daniel loved my ambition. He bragged to his friends about dating a woman who led tech teams and spoke at conferences. He'd bring me coffee during late-night coding sessions, said my passion was attractive. We split household chores equally. He even told his mother once that he was lucky to find someone who challenged him intellectually. That was before his dad retired and his parents started visiting more often. Suddenly Daniel noticed things. Why didn't I pack his lunch like his mother did for his father? Why was our house not spotless when his mother kept theirs immaculate? Why did I order takeout when his mother cooked 3 meals from scratch daily? His mother, Nancy, would smile sweetly while mentioning she never let her husband see her without makeup. She'd reorganize my kitchen while I was at work, leaving passive-aggressive notes about proper wife duties. After one visit, Daniel started leaving his dishes in the sink for me to wash, said his mother was right that men shouldn't do kitchen work. When I reminded him we both worked full-time, he said his father worked too, but never touched a dish. The comments escalated. He wanted me to wake up earlier to make him breakfast, asked why I wore pants instead of dresses, suggested I should stop going to gym classes and learn to bake instead. Each demand came with a comparison to Nancy. His mother never argued with his father. His mother always had dinner ready at 6. His mother gave up her nursing career without complaint. Then came the children's conversation. We'd always planned on kids, had even picked out names, but now Daniel had conditions. I needed to prove I could be a proper mother first. That meant quitting my job, learning his mother's recipes, keeping the house to Nancy's standards. He actually made a list. 27 items I needed to change about myself. Number 14 was learning to smile more when he criticized me, because his mother never looked upset when his father corrected her. I took that list and did something with it. But first I had to prepare. I called my friend Rosa, who's a realtor, and asked her to find me an apartment immediately. While Daniel was at work, I moved half my things out, just the essentials and everything I'd bought myself. Left all the gifts from his family. Then I invited Nancy over for tea, just the two of us. I told her Daniel and I were having problems and I needed her advice. She lit up, ready to tell me everything wrong with me. I let her talk for an hour, recording every word on my phone. She explained how she trained Daniel's father to expect certain things, how she made sure her son would know his worth and never settle for a career woman who couldn't properly care for a man. She actually said the words, broken him in like a horse, about her husband. She was proud of manipulating her son into wanting a servant instead of a partner. The next morning, Daniel woke up to an empty bed and a gift box on his pillow. Inside was the list he'd given me, torn into pieces, and a printed transcript of his mother's confession about training men like animals. Underneath was my wedding ring and a business card from my divorce lawyer. I'd already filed the papers. The apartment I'd signed a lease for was across from my office, a gorgeous loft Nancy would call wasteful for a single woman. Daniel called 17 times that day. His mother called too, screeching about how I'd tricked her and ruined her son's life. Then Monday morning, as I was about to go to work, a sudden wave of nausea hit me so hard I barely made it to the bathroom. My hands trembled as I stared at the calendar, realizing I was 2 weeks late. I grabbed my phone with shaking fingers and ordered a pregnancy test through a same-day delivery app, the kind that promises arrival within an hour. The wait felt endless as I sat on my bathroom floor, my mind doing math I didn't want it to do. That last week before I moved out, we'd had sex twice, both times feeling mechanical and wrong, like Daniel was trying to prove something. I remembered lying there afterward, already planning my escape, already knowing the marriage was over. The doorbell rang exactly 53 minutes later, and I practically ran to grab the package from the delivery person. Back in the bathroom, I read the instructions 3 times, even though I already knew how these things worked. The 3 minutes of waiting after peeing on the stick were the longest of my life. I paced my small bathroom, counting tiles, checking my phone, anything to avoid looking at the test sitting on the counter. When I finally looked, 2 pink lines stared back at me, clear and definite. My legs went weak and I sat down hard on the closed toilet lid. The irony hit me like a punch to the stomach. Daniel had wanted me to prove I could be a proper mother before he'd even consider having kids with me, and now I was pregnant anyway, doing it completely without him. I picked up my phone and called Rosa before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, and I barely got the words out before my voice cracked. She said she'd be there in 20 minutes and to not do anything until she arrived. I sat on my living room floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, still holding the positive test, when Rosa knocked. She came in with another pregnancy test, a different brand, saying we needed to confirm before I made any decisions. We sat on the floor together while I took the second test, and when it also showed positive, the reality became impossible to deny. Rosa put her arm around my shoulders and reminded me that I had options, that that I had time to figure out what I wanted, that this didn't have to define my entire future. The words helped me breathe again, helped me think past the immediate panic. We talked for 2 hours about what being a single mother would mean, about my career, about Daniel, about everything. Rosa never told me what to do, just listened and asked questions that helped me process. By the time she left, I knew I needed medical confirmation, and I needed to tell Nina before anyone else found out. The next morning, I called my insurance company and got a list of OB/GYN doctors who were accepting new patients. The first one I called had an opening on Thursday, 3 days away, and I took it immediately. Then I called Nina's office, and her assistant Tamara said she could fit me in that afternoon for a quick consultation. I spent the rest of the day at my computer, searching for information about pregnancy and divorce proceedings, reading forum posts from other women who'd been in similar situations. The legal stuff was overwhelming and complicated. Some states required waiting periods, some had different rules about custody arrangements made before birth, some had provisions about paternity establishment. My head hurt from trying to understand it all, and I finally closed my laptop and just sat there staring at my new apartment walls. Thursday came, and I drove to the doctor's office with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight. The waiting room had cheerful posters about prenatal care and breastfeeding, and I felt like an imposter sitting there with my life falling apart. The doctor was efficient and kind, doing an exam and an ultrasound that showed a tiny blob she said was about 6 weeks along. 6 weeks meant conception happened during that awful final week before I moved out, when Daniel and I were barely speaking except to fight. The doctor gave me pamphlets about pregnancy options, prenatal vitamins, what to expect in the coming months. My hands shook as I took them, and she must have noticed because she asked if I had support at home. I lied and said yes. Walking out of that clinic into the bright afternoon sun, I felt the weight of what I needed to do next. Daniel would find out eventually, and I needed Nina to know first so we could prepare. Nina's office was downtown in a tall building with too much glass. I sat across from her desk and told her about the pregnancy, watching her face stay calm and professional even though this had to complicate everything. She asked questions about timing, about my certainty, about what I wanted to do. When I said I was keeping the baby, she nodded and started making notes. She explained that pregnancy complicated but didn't stop divorce proceedings, that we'd need to be strategic about when Daniel found out because it would definitely affect his approach. We talked through different scenarios for telling him. Nina thought I should do it directly rather than letting him find out some other way, but only after we'd prepared for how he might respond legally. She predicted he'd try to use the pregnancy to force reconciliation or delay the divorce. We scheduled another meeting for the following week to discuss strategy once I'd had time to process everything. I left her office feeling slightly less panicked, having a plan even if it was just the beginning of one. The next 3 days were torture as I rehearsed different ways to tell Daniel about the pregnancy. Every version sounded wrong in my head. Too apologetic, too defensive, too casual, too dramatic. I wrote scripts and deleted them, practiced in the mirror, and hated how I sounded. Rosa came over twice to help me rehearse, playing Daniel's part and throwing out the responses he might have. None of it felt right, but I knew I couldn't put it off forever. On Sunday evening, I finally sent Daniel a text asking to meet at the coffee shop near my office on Monday morning to discuss something important. His response came back in less than 2 minutes, saying he'd be there and asking if I was reconsidering the divorce. The hope in his message made my stomach hurt because I knew I was about to make everything more complicated. Monday morning, I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early and ordered tea I couldn't drink. Daniel arrived exactly on time, looking more put together than he had in weeks, like he'd dressed carefully for this. He started to sit down with a smile on his face, clearly ready to make some kind of speech about us trying again. I cut him off before he could start and just said it. I told him I was pregnant. His face went through, so many expressions in about 10 seconds that I almost felt sorry for him. Shock first, his eyes going wide. Then joy, this brief flash of happiness. Then confusion as he processed what this meant given our situation. And finally calculation, his expression shifting into something harder as he figured out his angle. He said this changed everything, that we needed to call off the divorce for the baby's sake, that we owed it to our child to try again. I explained that being pregnant didn't change why I left, or what he'd demanded from me. Daniel's voice got louder as he argued that a child needs both parents in the same home, that his own upbringing proved that traditional families work best. When I pointed out that his mother's influence was exactly what destroyed our marriage, he got defensive fast. His voice rose enough that other customers started looking at our table, and the barista glanced over with concern. Daniel insisted we owed it to our child to try again, promising he'd be different this time, that he understood now what he'd done wrong. I reminded him about his 27-item list of changes he wanted from me, and asked which specific demands he was withdrawing. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. He still wanted the same submissive wife his mother had been, just now with pregnancy as extra leverage to get it. I stood up and grabbed my bag while Daniel called after me, saying I was being selfish and destroying our family before it even started. Other people definitely stared now, but I didn't care. I walked out to my car and sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked, my hands shaking again. I called Nina and told her the meeting went exactly as badly as we'd predicted. She said to expect Daniel's lawyer to file motions soon, probably arguing that pregnancy meant we needed to attempt reconciliation, or at least delay proceedings until after the baby was born. She said she'd start preparing our counter-arguments, and that I should forward her any communication from Daniel. I drove back to my apartment feeling exhausted, and it wasn't even noon yet. 2 days later, Nina called while I was trying to work from home between bathroom trips. Daniel's lawyer Omar had filed a motion to pause the divorce until after the baby was born, claiming we needed time to attempt reconciliation for the child's sake. Nina said she expected this move and already had our response drafted, pointing out that pregnancy didn't erase my right to leave a marriage where my husband demanded I quit my job and become his servant. We had a court date scheduled 3 weeks out to argue the motion in front of a judge. The legal stuff made my head hurt, but Nina walked me through every step and promised we had a strong case. I hung up and stared at my laptop screen, trying to focus on the code review I was supposed to finish. My project deadline was coming up fast, and morning sickness was making everything 10 times harder. I'd run to the bathroom 4 times already that morning, and it wasn't even lunch yet. At the office the next day, I made it through exactly 1 meeting before I had to bolt for the nearest bathroom. When I came back, my team lead Sienna was waiting by my desk with a concerned look on her face. She asked if I was okay, and I could tell she'd noticed the pattern over the past few days. I made a quick decision right there because I needed support at work, and Sienna had always been fair with me. I asked if we could talk in her office privately, and once the door closed, I told her everything. The pregnancy, the divorce, the whole mess with Daniel and his mother. Sienna listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she immediately started problem solving. She said we could adjust my project load to give me more flexible deadlines, and she'd work with me to schedule important meetings during times when my morning sickness was usually better. Then she suggested I talk to HR about formalizing accommodations, so everything would be documented and protected. I felt grateful for her support, but also anxious about my pregnancy becoming office knowledge while I was going through a divorce. People would have opinions, and I didn't want to deal with judgment on top of everything else. That evening, my phone rang with Nancy's number on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Her voice was sticky sweet, saying Daniel had told her about the baby, and she wanted to help us work things out for the grandchild's sake. I told her there was nothing to discuss, that the divorce was moving forward regardless of the pregnancy. Nancy's tone shifted immediately, dropping the fake kindness. She started in on how I was already being a bad mother by choosing my career over family, how I was being selfish and stubborn, how Daniel deserved a wife who would raise his child properly. I let her talk, my finger hovering over the record button on my phone. The second time she called, I was ready. I started recording before I even said hello, and Nancy didn't disappoint. She went on about how working mothers damage their children, how I was proving I wasn't fit to be a parent, how Daniel's father would never have tolerated this kind of behavior from her. She actually said I was destroying my baby's chance at a proper family because I refused to submit to my husband's reasonable requests. When she paused for breath, I calmly mentioned that I was recording the call just like I'd recorded our tea conversation. Nancy sputtered, called me sneaky and manipulative, then hung up abruptly. I saved the recording and sent it to Nina with a note about harassment. 3 weeks crawled by with work stress and legal prep filling every hour. The court hearing arrived on a cold morning, and I met Nina outside the courthouse at 8. Inside, Omar stood next to Daniel looking confident and prepared. Omar argued that major decisions about the pregnancy required marital unity, that a child deserved parents who were at least attempting reconciliation, that the stress of divorce could harm the baby. Nina countered that pregnancy didn't eliminate my right to divorce an abusive situation, and she brought up Daniel's 27-item list as evidence that reconciliation wasn't possible. She pointed out that his demands for me to quit my job proved he wanted control, not partnership. The judge listened to both sides, then denied the motion to pause the divorce. But he also ordered us into mediation to establish guidelines for prenatal decisions and future custody arrangements. Daniel's face went red, but he stayed quiet as we filed out of the courtroom. Our first mediation session happened the following week in a bland conference room with beige walls. Daniel showed up with another list, this one detailing what I should eat during pregnancy, which doctor I should see, how many hours I should work per week. The mediator, an older woman with glasses, cut him off before he got through the first page. She explained very clearly that he had no legal right to control my prenatal choices while we were separated, that those decisions were mine alone until the baby was born. Daniel's face turned red again, and a vein in his forehead stood out, but he pressed his lips together and stayed silent for the rest of the hour-long session. I was 10 weeks pregnant when Sienna called me into her office with an excited look on her face. Our company was bidding for a huge contract with a major client, and they wanted me to lead the technical proposal team. She acknowledged my pregnancy and divorce situation directly, asking if I could honestly handle the pressure and timeline. The proposal was due in 6 weeks, and it would mean long hours and high stress. I looked at Sienna and made my decision right there. I told her yes, I could handle it, because I needed to prove to myself and everyone else that pregnancy didn't make me less capable professionally. The work turned out to be intense, exactly as Sienna warned. I spent long days reviewing technical specs, coordinating with team members, writing sections of the proposal. My team was supportive, covering for me when I needed to leave for doctor appointments, or when morning sickness hit hard. They never made me feel guilty about it, just picked up the slack and kept moving forward. The project gave me something concrete to focus on besides divorce stress and Nancy's harassment. Then Daniel started texting me constantly. Pregnancy articles, advice about prenatal vitamins, opinions about birth plans, suggestions for baby names. My phone buzzed every few hours with another message about something I should or shouldn't do. I finally sent him a text setting a clear boundary. All non-emergency communication had to go through our lawyers. His response was to have Nancy start texting me instead, sending her own advice and criticism. I blocked her number without responding, then blocked Daniel's number too when he sent a message saying I was being unreasonable about simple parenting discussions. The 12-week ultrasound appointment arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I sat in the waiting room filling out forms about my medical history. When the technician called my name, I followed her into a dim room with the ultrasound machine already set up. She squeezed cold gel on my stomach and pressed the wand against my skin, moving it around slowly while watching the screen. Then she turned the monitor toward me and pointed at a tiny shape that looked more like a person than I expected. I could see the head and body clearly, even little arms and legs moving slightly. The technician measured different parts and typed notes into her computer, explaining that everything looked normal and healthy. She printed out several pictures and handed them to me, asking if I wanted to know the sex at my next appointment around 16 weeks. I stared at the grainy black and white images in my hands and realized I had no idea if Daniel should be part of these decisions. The baby was real now, not just nausea and a positive test, and I needed to figure out how much to include him in this pregnancy. I scheduled my next appointment and drove straight to Nina's office without calling first. Her assistant said she was between meetings and could see me for 20 minutes. I showed Nina the ultrasound photos and asked what I was legally required to tell Daniel about the pregnancy. She leaned back in her chair and explained that excluding him from all pregnancy information could hurt me later in custody negotiations. Judges like to see parents who tried to cooperate and include each other, even during divorce. I hated the answer but understood the strategy. We agreed I would send him ultrasound photos and basic medical updates through her office, keeping everything factual and brief. Nina would forward the information to Omar, so there was a paper trail of my cooperation. Within 2 hours of Nina sending the first ultrasound photo, Omar responded with a formal letter demanding that Daniel be allowed to attend all prenatal appointments. Nina drafted our response explaining that he had no legal right to be present during medical procedures while we were separated. The back and forth continued for days, with Omar pushing for more access and Nina holding firm on boundaries. 3 days later, Sienna called me into her office with a huge smile on her face. Our company had won the major contract I spent 6 weeks leading the technical proposal for. She told the whole team in our morning meeting, specifically mentioning my technical leadership and strategic planning. Everyone clapped and several coworkers stopped by my desk afterward to congratulate me. That afternoon, Victor from HR called my extension and asked me to come up to his office. He congratulated me on the contract win and said the executive team was considering me for a promotion to senior architect. The timing was complicated with my pregnancy and divorce, but he wanted me to know they valued my work and saw a future for me at the company. I thanked him and walked back to my desk feeling like maybe I could actually handle being a single mother with a demanding career. By 16 weeks, my pregnancy started showing enough that loose shirts didn't hide it anymore. I needed to tell my extended team before people started gossiping. I sent a brief email to the department mentioning my due date in late spring and that I would be planning maternity leave. Most responses were positive and supportive, with people offering congratulations and asking if I needed anything. But I noticed a few colleagues seemed awkward around me afterward, probably because they knew about my divorce. One guy who used to chat with me daily suddenly found reasons to avoid the break room when I was there. A week later, Nina called me sounding angrier than I had ever heard her. Daniel had filed a motion for temporary spousal support, claiming he needed financial help since we were still legally married. She was furious because his salary was decent, and this was obviously a control move. We spent 2 hours going through my bank statements and expenses, documenting that I had been completely supporting myself since separation. Nina prepared a counter motion showing that Daniel had no legitimate basis for claiming financial need. The spousal support hearing happened on a cold morning 3 weeks later. I sat next to Nina while Omar presented Daniel's case about needing help with his expenses. Then Nina stood up and walked the judge through Daniel's spending since I left. She had bank records showing expensive dinners at restaurants, new clothes from high-end stores, and a lease on a luxury car he signed just 2 months ago. The judge looked at Daniel and asked why he needed spousal support if he could afford a car payment higher than most people's rent. Daniel's face turned red, but he stayed quiet. The judge denied his motion and made a comment about his spending patterns showing no actual hardship. As we left the courtroom, Daniel stared at me with pure anger in his eyes. That afternoon, I called a therapist named Susan who specialized in pregnancy during major life changes. Rosa had recommended her after I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by everything happening at once. Susan had an opening the next week, and I took it immediately. At our first session, she asked me to talk about how I was feeling about having Daniel's baby while divorcing him. I explained the whole situation from the 27-item list to Nancy's manipulation to the pregnancy timing. Susan listened without judging and then helped me identify specific worries I could work on. We talked about strategies for managing stress that would not hurt the pregnancy, like meditation and exercise and setting clear boundaries. By the end of the hour, I felt like maybe therapy could actually help me get through this. At 20 weeks, I went in for the anatomy scan where they check all the baby's organs and measurements. The technician was thorough, taking pictures of everything and explaining what she saw. Then she asked if I wanted to know the sex. I said yes immediately. She smiled and told me I was having a daughter. The news hit me harder than I expected because all I could think about was Nancy spending 40 years serving her husband, and Daniel wanting me to become exactly like her. I drove home from the appointment with tears running down my face, but they were not sad tears. I felt determined that my daughter would grow up seeing a mother who chose independence and self-respect instead of staying in a marriage that demanded she become someone else. I sent Nina an email that evening with the news about having a daughter, keeping it simple and factual. She forwarded it to Omar's office the next morning. His response came back within hours and was surprisingly emotional. He said Daniel always wanted a daughter and was begging for a chance to be involved in her life. Nina called me after reading it and reminded me that Daniel would be involved as her father no matter how our divorce ended. That was a reality I was still trying to accept. 2 weeks later, Sienna called me into her office again and told me my promotion to senior architect had been approved. The raise was significant and would take effect after I returned from maternity leave. She assured me the company valued me and wanted to keep my talent long term. Walking out of her office, I felt the financial security settle over me like a warm blanket. I could afford good childcare, a comfortable home, everything my daughter would need. Being a single mother was scary, but at least I would not be doing it while struggling to pay bills. A week after my promotion came through, Omar sent Nina a formal request for Daniel to meet with me face-to-face without lawyers present to discuss our daughter's future. Nina called me immediately and said it could be a trap or manipulation tactic, but I surprised myself by wanting to hear what he had to say. We agreed to meet at the mediator's office with Nina there as a neutral observer, which gave me some protection while still allowing the conversation Daniel wanted. The morning of the meeting, I put on my favorite work dress that still fit over my growing belly and drove to the mediator's building downtown. Daniel was already there when I arrived, sitting in the waiting room with his hands folded in his lap. He looked different somehow, less angry and more scared, like he was afraid of what might happen in the next hour. The mediator led us into a conference room with a large table and comfortable chairs, and Nina sat beside me while Daniel sat across from us. He started talking before anyone else could say anything, his words coming out fast and nervous. He said he knew he messed up our marriage and understood why I left, but he was terrified of being shut out of his daughter's life completely. His voice cracked when he talked about missing her entire childhood because of his own mistakes. I watched him carefully, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd grown used to, but all I saw was genuine fear and regret. The mediator asked Daniel what he hoped to accomplish in this meeting, and he explained that he'd been in therapy since I moved out, and was starting to understand how his parents' marriage had damaged his view of relationships. He said his therapist helped him see that he'd been trying to recreate his parents' dynamic, instead of building something healthy with me. Daniel looked directly at me and said he wasn't asking me to come back or forgive him. He just wanted a chance to prove he could be a good father, even though he failed as a husband. I felt skeptical hearing this because people can say anything in therapy, but I agreed to listen to what he proposed. Nina squeezed my hand under the table, reminding me she was there to protect my interests. Over the next 2 hours, we worked with the mediator to establish a preliminary custody framework that felt workable for everyone. Daniel would have regular visitation after our daughter was born, starting with supervised visits at my apartment and building toward overnight stays as she got older. I would maintain full decision-making authority during the pregnancy since it was my body and my health, but we would share legal custody after birth so he could be involved in major decisions about her upbringing. The mediator wrote everything down and said she'd draft a formal agreement for our lawyers to review. Walking out of that meeting, I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe we could co-parent without constant fighting, but I knew I needed to see consistent action before I trusted Daniel's words. 3 weeks later, I was at my apartment working from home when building security called my phone. They said Nancy was in the lobby demanding to come up and talk to me about her granddaughter, and they wanted to know if I'd given her permission to visit. My blood pressure spiked immediately as I told them to send her away and not let her up under any circumstances. Security said they would handle it, but 10 minutes later they called back to say Nancy was refusing to leave and causing a scene. I threw on shoes and went down to the lobby myself, finding Nancy standing by the elevators and yelling at the security guard about her rights as a grandmother. When she saw me, she started walking toward me with her arms out like she expected a hug. I stepped back and told her she needed to leave my building immediately, or I would call the police. Nancy's face turned red and she started crying, saying I was keeping her from her only grandchild and being cruel. The security guard asked if I wanted him to call the police, and I said yes without hesitation. Nancy left before the police arrived, but I went straight to Nina's office afterward to file a formal trespass warning that would make Nancy's presence at my building illegal. Nina handled the paperwork and said we now had documentation of Nancy's harassment if we needed it for custody proceedings. That evening, Daniel called me and apologized for his mother's behavior before I could even bring it up. He said he told Nancy she needed to respect boundaries, or she wouldn't have any access to the baby after birth, and that he supported the trespass warning I filed. I was genuinely surprised to hear him stand up to his mother like that, but I told him I needed to see consistent follow-through before I trusted this change. Nina made notes about Daniel's statement during our next meeting, documenting his willingness to enforce boundaries with Nancy in case her harassment continued. 2 weeks later, at my routine prenatal appointment, the nurse took my blood pressure 3 times because it kept coming back high. The doctor came in looking concerned and asked about my stress levels, and I ended up telling her about the divorce, Nancy's harassment, and the custody negotiations. She warned me that I needed to manage my anxiety better for the pregnancy's health, suggesting meditation, gentle exercise, and possibly medication if things didn't improve. I left that appointment feeling scared about harming my daughter with stress, so I called Susan and asked to increase our therapy sessions to twice a week. She agreed immediately, and also suggested I try a prenatal yoga class that focused on relaxation and breathing techniques. The yoga studio was near my apartment, and I signed up for the beginner class that met 3 times a week. The first session was awkward because I didn't know anyone and felt self-conscious about my growing belly, but the instructor was kind and helped me modify poses that were uncomfortable. After class, one of the other women introduced herself as Tamara and asked how far along I was. We started talking about pregnancy and work-life balance, and she mentioned she worked as a paralegal at a family law firm. Something about her name seemed familiar, and when I asked which firm, she said Nina's office. We both laughed at the coincidence, and Tamara said she'd been working on my divorce paperwork, but couldn't talk about it professionally. Over the next few weeks, we became friendly outside the legal context, meeting for coffee after yoga and texting about pregnancy symptoms. Tamara shared her own experience with divorce and co-parenting her 5-year-old son, which helped me feel less alone in my situation. She understood both the legal complexity and the emotional difficulty of my circumstances, which made her support especially valuable. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings moved toward resolution, as Nina and Omar negotiated the final settlement terms. Daniel agreed to a clean split of assets with no spousal support, and we formalized the custody arrangement we'd developed in mediation. Nina called me one afternoon sounding pleased and said we were close to finalizing everything before the baby arrived, which would make the postpartum period much less complicated legally. At 28 weeks pregnant, Rosa insisted on throwing me a baby shower even though I said I didn't want a big event. She promised to keep it small and meaningful, just close friends who genuinely cared about me and my daughter. The shower happened at Rosa's house on a Saturday afternoon with Rosa, Sienna, Susan, Tamara, and 3 coworkers from my team. No one from Daniel's family was invited, which felt both liberating and sad because I'd imagined sharing this moment with in-laws when we were still married. We played simple games, ate cake, and opened gifts while everyone shared parenting advice and funny stories. Walking out with a car full of baby supplies and genuine well wishes from people who supported me, I felt hopeful for the first time in months about my future as a mother. 2 weeks later, Daniel sent me a text asking if he could attend a prenatal class with me to prepare for being present during visits with our daughter. I discussed it with Nina first, and she said it could demonstrate his commitment to being an involved father, which might help with custody arrangements. I agreed to one class about newborn care, making it clear we were keeping this focused on practical parenting skills and nothing personal. The class met on a Wednesday evening at the hospital where I planned to deliver, and Daniel arrived early with a notebook and pen. He was attentive throughout the 2-hour session, asking good questions about diaper changes, feeding schedules, and safe sleep practices. Watching him practice swaddling a doll with genuine concentration, I saw glimpses of the man I married before his parents' influence warped him into someone I didn't recognize. After class, we walked to our cars together, and Daniel thanked me for letting him participate, saying it meant everything to feel included in preparing for our daughter's arrival. I told him this didn't change anything about our divorce, but I appreciated his effort to be a good father, and he nodded like he understood the boundaries I was setting. 2 weeks later, Nina called me at work to say the divorce papers were ready for final signatures. I drove to her office that afternoon, my belly pressing against the steering wheel at 32 weeks pregnant. The conference room felt cold and official as I signed my name on each page, watching my marriage legally dissolve into a stack of documents. Nina pushed the papers across the table and told me I'd protected both my autonomy and my daughter's future by refusing to accept Daniel's demands. I nodded but felt an odd mix of relief and sadness, like closing a book I'd once loved, but that had turned into something I didn't recognize. Walking back to my car, I placed my hand on my belly and whispered that she'd never see her mother diminish herself for anyone's approval. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel that made me sit up straighter on my couch. He wrote that his therapist helped him understand how unfair and damaging his expectations had been, that he wanted our daughter to see both parents as equals instead of copying his parents' toxic dynamic. The message felt genuine in a way his previous apologies hadn't, but I knew only consistent actions over months and years would prove whether he truly meant it. I saved the text and sent back a simple response saying I appreciated his honesty and hoped he'd follow through for our daughter's sake. 3 days later, A thick cream envelope arrived in my mailbox with Nancy's return address written in her perfect cursive. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won, and I tore the seal. The letter inside apologized for her behavior and begged to be part of her granddaughter's life, promising she'd changed and understood her mistakes. Reading between the formal words, the apology felt performative rather than genuine, like she'd written what she thought I wanted to hear without actually meaning it. I called Nina and read her the letter over the phone, and we agreed that Nancy could have supervised visits only after the baby arrived, with clear boundaries about respecting my parenting choices. I filed the letter away and decided not to respond, letting my silence communicate that access to my daughter was a privilege she'd need to earn through consistent, respectful behavior. The weeks crawled by as my due date approached, my body growing heavier and more uncomfortable while I tied up loose ends at work and prepared my apartment for a newborn. At 38 weeks, I woke up at 3 in the morning with contractions that felt different from the practice ones I'd been having. I timed them for an hour, watching the intervals get closer together, before I called Rosa and told her it was happening. She arrived at my apartment within 20 minutes, helping me grab my hospital bag and timing contractions in the car, while I focused on breathing through each wave. At the hospital entrance, I texted Daniel that I'd been admitted, per our agreement that he'd be notified when labor started. The labor and delivery nurse got me settled in a room and checked my progress while Rosa held my hand and reminded me to breathe. Daniel showed up an hour later carrying a bouquet of pink roses, his face showing genuine concern mixed with nervousness. I told him through the doorway that Rosa was my birth support person, and he needed to stay in the waiting room, which he accepted without argument. The next 12 hours blurred together into a cycle of contractions, breathing techniques, and Rosa's steady presence keeping me focused. When the doctor finally said it was time to push, Rosa gripped my hand and told me I was the strongest person she knew. My daughter arrived at 6:30 in the evening, healthy and screaming, with a full head of dark hair like mine. The nurse placed her on my chest and I stared at her tiny, perfect face, feeling a love so fierce it nearly stopped my breathing. I named her Maya after my grandmother who'd been fiercely independent her whole life, never letting anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do. When I felt ready an hour later, I allowed Daniel to come in briefly to meet his daughter. He approached the bed slowly, his eyes red like he'd been crying in the waiting room. I passed Maya carefully into his arms and watched his face transform as he looked down at her, genuine love and fear mixing in his expression. He whispered that he was scared of messing up, but promised to be the father she deserved, and for the first time since our separation, I believed he was capable of change. The first week home with Maya was exhausting and wonderful in ways I hadn't imagined. Rosa stayed in my guest room for 3 days, helping with diaper changes and holding Maya so I could shower and sleep. Sienna organized meal deliveries from my work team, so I didn't have to worry about cooking while learning to breastfeed and function on 2-hour sleep cycles. Daniel texted every day asking about Maya and sending encouraging messages, but he respected my need for recovery time before starting visits. I sent him photos of Maya sleeping and told him we'd schedule his first visit once I felt more settled. At 2 weeks postpartum, Daniel came to my apartment for his first supervised visit with Maya. He arrived exactly on time, carrying a gift bag with a stuffed elephant, and looking nervous enough that his hands shook when I passed Maya to him. I sat on the couch watching as he held her awkwardly at first, then gradually relaxed as she settled against his chest. He talked to her softly about how much he loved her, and how he'd work every day to be a good father. The visit lasted an hour and went well enough that we scheduled regular visits twice a week, building toward him taking her to his place once she was older and I felt comfortable. A week later, an enormous box arrived at my apartment filled with expensive baby clothes, toys, and a designer diaper bag. Nancy's card tucked inside offered another apology and asked when she could meet her granddaughter. I texted Daniel about the gifts and my decision to maintain the boundary that his mother couldn't visit until I was ready. His response surprised me by saying he'd already told Nancy she needed to earn trust back through consistent, respectful behavior, and he supported my timeline completely. This was the first time I'd seen him truly prioritize boundaries with his parents over their demands. The weeks blurred together in a cycle of feeding, changing, sleeping when Maya slept, and slowly healing from childbirth. At 12 weeks postpartum, I returned to work with a mix of anxiety and relief at using my brain for something besides baby care. My company had arranged flexible remote options so I could work from home 3 days a week, and they'd set up a private lactation room for the days I came into the office. The senior architect role challenged me in good ways, giving me problems to solve that had nothing to do with sleep schedules or diaper rashes. Maya thrived with the nanny I'd hired, a kind woman with excellent references who sent me photos throughout the day. I felt confident balancing career and motherhood on my own terms, proving to myself that I didn't have to choose between the two. Daniel had progressed to unsupervised visits by then, taking Maya to his apartment every Saturday for 4 hours. He'd set up a proper nursery with a crib, changing table, and all the baby equipment he needed. He sent me photos of their time together, showing Maya in various outfits or sleeping on his chest while he watched her with obvious adoration. Our co-parenting relationship had become cordial and focused entirely on Maya's well-being rather than our past conflicts, which felt like the healthiest outcome we could have achieved from our failed marriage. 6 months after Maya's birth, Daniel texted asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss something about his therapy progress. I agreed to meet at the cafe near my apartment, bringing Maya in her carrier since she was due for a feeding soon. Daniel arrived looking different somehow, less tense around his shoulders, and he smiled at Maya before sitting down across from me. He explained that his therapist had suggested he join a support group for men who were working to unlearn toxic relationship patterns they'd absorbed from their families. The group met weekly and included guys dealing with everything from controlling behavior to emotional unavailability, all trying to figure out healthier ways to relate to women and partners. Daniel said the group had helped him see how his parents' marriage model had damaged his view of what partnership should look like, how he'd been trained to expect service instead of equality. I listened while feeding Maya her bottle, watching his face for signs this was manipulation or performance. He seemed genuine, talking about specific realizations he'd had about respect and autonomy. I told him I appreciated his growth and was glad he was working on himself, but I made clear that our relationship would remain focused on co-parenting Maya, nothing more. He nodded and said he understood, that he wasn't asking for anything beyond proving he could be a better father and co-parent. 2 weeks later, Nancy finally met Maya under conditions I'd specified. We arranged to meet at a family-friendly restaurant with outdoor seating, both Daniel and me present, for exactly 1 hour. Nancy arrived 15 minutes early, which didn't surprise me, carrying an enormous bag of gifts I'd already decided Maya didn't need. She cooed over Maya in her stroller, her hands shaking slightly as she reached out to touch her granddaughter's tiny fingers. For the first 30 minutes, Nancy stayed on her best behavior, asking appropriate questions about Maya's sleep schedule and feeding routine. Then she started making comments about how I should be dressing Maya in more pink, how babies needed to be held more than I was probably holding her while working, how formula would never be as good as extended breastfeeding. I shut each comment down immediately, keeping my voice calm but firm. Daniel surprised me by backing me up, telling his mother that I made all the parenting decisions, and she needed to respect that without commentary. Nancy's mouth tightened into a thin line, but she didn't argue back. The visit ended exactly at the 1 hour mark, and I packed Maya up while Nancy promised she'd follow whatever rules I set. I didn't fully believe her, but Daniel's support had been real, which mattered more. Maya's first birthday party took over my apartment's community room, decorated with simple rainbow streamers and a smash cake I'd ordered from the bakery down the street. I'd scheduled 2 separate shifts to avoid conflict between families. My side came first, Rosa and Sienna bringing gifts and helping set up the food table while Maya crawled around exploring everything. Daniel arrived exactly on time for the second shift with his parents, and I watched Nancy's face carefully as she took in the decorations and the casual setup that was nothing like the elaborate parties she'd probably thrown for Daniel. We'd agreed beforehand that Daniel and I would present a united front, standing together while Maya demolished her cake and got frosting everywhere. Several of Daniel's relatives commented on how well we were co-parenting, how mature we were being for Maya's sake, and I felt genuinely proud of what we'd built. Maya laughed and clapped her frosting-covered hands, completely unaware of the divorce or the complicated family dynamics, just happy to be celebrated. Daniel helped clean up after his family left, and we worked together efficiently, the same way we used to tackle household projects before everything fell apart. He left with a container of leftover cake and a photo of Maya covered in frosting that I'd texted to his phone. 3 months after Maya's birthday, a recruiter from a competing tech company reached out about a senior architect position with better benefits and a 20% salary increase. The role involved leading their cloud infrastructure team and working on projects that would challenge me in exactly the ways I'd been craving. I scheduled a call with Daniel before responding to the offer, explaining how the new position would affect our custody schedule since the office was across town. He asked good questions about my commute time and whether I'd need to adjust pickup and drop-off times, but he never once suggested I shouldn't take the opportunity. Instead, he said he was proud of my career success, and we'd figure out the logistics to make it work for Maya. We spent an hour on the phone mapping out a revised parenting plan that accommodated my new work requirements, and he volunteered to handle more of the evening pickups from daycare. I accepted the position the next day and gave notice at my current company, where Sienna threw me a goodbye lunch and made me promise to stay in touch. The new job started 4 weeks later, and the benefits package included better childcare support and more flexible remote options than my previous role. 6 months into my new job, Daniel mentioned during a custody exchange that he'd started dating someone. He didn't offer details, just said it was early but going well, and he wanted to give me a heads up before it got serious. I appreciated the transparency and told him I was glad he was moving forward. 3 months after that, he asked if we could talk about introducing his girlfriend to Maya. We met at the park while Maya played on the toddler equipment, and Daniel explained that his relationship had become serious enough that he wanted his girlfriend to be part of his life with Maya. He asked about my thoughts on timing and what boundaries I wanted in place. I told him I needed to meet her first, at least twice, before she spent time with Maya, and that introduction should be gradual and low-key. Daniel agreed immediately and thanked me for being reasonable about it. His new relationship seemed healthier than our marriage had been, with him talking about actual partnership and mutual support instead of service and traditional roles. The therapy and the support group appeared to be genuinely helping him build better patterns. Nancy's supervised visits had gone well enough over the following months that we decided to allow her limited time with Maya at Daniel's apartment when he was home. She'd learned to mostly keep her opinions to herself, though she still occasionally made passive-aggressive comments about working mothers or proper child rearing. The difference was that Daniel now shut her down himself instead of expecting me to handle it. When Nancy suggested that Maya should be learning to sit still and quiet instead of being so active, Daniel told his mother that Maya's curiosity and energy were good things, and Nancy needed to stop criticizing. The progress wasn't perfect, and I still watched Nancy carefully during handoffs, but the boundaries were holding. Maya seemed comfortable with her grandmother, reaching for her during visits and babbling happily, which mattered more than Nancy's occasional comments. At 18 months old, Maya started showing a personality that reminded me so much of myself it was almost funny. She wanted to do everything herself, from feeding to getting dressed, and she'd get frustrated when her toddler coordination didn't match her determination. She asked constant questions about how things worked, pointing at everything and demanding to know why. When I told her no, she'd cross her tiny arms and argue back in her limited vocabulary, already assertive about what she wanted. During a playdate at Rosa's house, Maya insisted on climbing the big kid equipment instead of staying in the toddler area, and when Rosa tried to redirect her, Maya firmly said no and climbed anyway. I watched my daughter's independence developing, and felt grateful she was growing up seeing her mother as a successful professional who'd chosen self-respect over staying in an unhealthy marriage. She'd never know the version of me who almost let Daniel's demands diminish who I was. Daniel and I had a long conversation one evening after Maya's bedtime, sitting in my living room while she slept in the next room. He brought up our divorce, saying he'd been thinking about it a lot in therapy and with his support group. He admitted that staying married would have made him increasingly resentful, as I refused to become what he wanted, and it would have made me miserable trying to either conform or constantly fight his expectations. We talked honestly about how the marriage had failed not because we didn't love each other once, but because we'd grown into incompatible people who wanted fundamentally different things. Daniel said his parents' influence had poisoned something that might have survived if he'd been stronger earlier. I agreed that co-parenting as friends were better for Maya than staying in a toxic marriage would have been, that she'd benefit from seeing two parents who respected each other even after divorce. We finished the conversation with a hug, the first physical contact we'd had beyond custody exchanges in almost 2 years, and it felt like closing a chapter properly. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, I was thriving in ways I'd never imagined during those scary early days of pregnancy and separation. My role as senior architect had me leading major infrastructure projects for clients across multiple industries, and my team respected my technical judgment and leadership style. Maya was a happy, confident toddler who knew she was loved by both her parents and split her time between 2 homes without anxiety or confusion. Daniel and I had built a co-parenting relationship that prioritized our daughter's needs over our past conflicts, communicating efficiently about schedules and decisions without the anger that had marked our early separation. We attended Maya's daycare events together, coordinated holiday schedules without drama, and supported each other's parenting choices even when we didn't fully agree. Several divorced friends had commented that our arrangement was healthier than many intact marriages they knew. I started dating casually after matching with someone on an app Rosa had convinced me to try. The first few dates felt awkward, like I'd forgotten how to talk to someone without the weight of history and hurt between us. But gradually I remembered what it felt like to be seen as myself, not as someone's wife or ex-wife or Maya's mother, just as me. I went to dinners and movies, had conversations about books and travel and career ambitions, let myself enjoy getting to know someone new without the pressure of forever. Maya was secure and well-adjusted, playing happily with her toys when I left for dates, and running to hug me when I came home. My life looked nothing like the submissive housewife role Daniel had wanted me to become, and I was proud of the independence and self-respect I'd modeled for my daughter. She'd grow up knowing that women could be both mothers and accomplished professionals, that leaving an unhealthy situation was strength, not failure, and that her worth wasn't tied to serving someone else's vision of who she should be. Daniel texted me about 6 months later asking if we could meet at the coffee shop where we usually did custody exchanges because he had something important to discuss. I brought Maya with me since it was his weekend anyway, and when we arrived, a woman was sitting next to him at the table. He introduced her as his girlfriend of 4 months, and I could see the nervousness in both their faces as they waited for my reaction. She was warm when she said hello to Maya, crouching down to the toddler's level instead of talking over her head, and she told me she understood this was probably awkward, but Daniel wanted to do things right. Over the next several weeks, I saw her during custody exchanges, and noticed how gentle she was with Maya, how she asked me questions about my daughter's routines and preferences, instead of assuming she knew better. She never tried to replace me or overstep boundaries, and when Maya talked about mommy, she encouraged those conversations instead of redirecting them. Daniel seemed different around her too, more relaxed and less defensive, and I realized his therapy and support group work was showing up in how he chose partners now. When he called 8 months into their relationship to say they were engaged, I surprised myself by feeling genuinely happy for him. The ceremony for the Tech Industry Award happened on a Tuesday evening at a big hotel downtown, and Rosa took the afternoon off work to watch Maya so I could focus on my acceptance speech. My team from work filled 2 tables, and Sienna had organized the whole group to attend in support. When they called my name for the Leadership Excellence Award, I walked to the stage thinking about that list Daniel made 3 years ago, all 27 items he wanted me to change. Number 8 was spending less time on career advancement and more time learning domestic skills. Number 19 was stopping my conference speaking because it made me too proud. I held the award and looked out at the audience, seeing Maya sitting on Rosa's lap in the 3rd row, watching her mother receive recognition for technical work that changed how 3 major companies handled their infrastructure. My daughter would grow up knowing women could build careers and raise children, that success in one area didn't require sacrifice of the other. She'd never wonder if she had to choose between being smart and being loved, between ambition and family, between her own dreams and someone else's vision of who she should be. Nancy's evolution into a decent grandmother happened slowly over the following year, with plenty of setbacks along the way. She still made comments about how I dressed Maya or fed her, still suggested that working mothers missed important developmental moments, still implied that Daniel's girlfriend would make a better wife than I had been. But Daniel shut those comments down now, telling his mother that I was a good parent and she needed to respect my choices. When Nancy visited during his custody time, she followed the rules we established about bedtimes and screen time and food, mostly because Daniel enforced them consistently. Maya benefited from having grandparents who took her to the park and read her stories, even if those visits required clear boundaries to stay healthy. I watched my daughter hug Nancy goodbye after visits, and felt glad she had that relationship, complicated as it was. 3 years after I left Daniel, I sat in my living room watching Maya play with her blocks, building towers and knocking them down with delighted shrieks. My home was exactly what I wanted, decorated with my choices and filled with my things, a space that reflected who I actually was instead of who someone thought I should become. Work was going well with several major projects under my leadership and a team that respected my technical judgment. Maya was thriving, confident and curious, and loved by both her parents, splitting time between 2 homes without anxiety. Daniel and I had built a co-parenting relationship that worked, communicating about schedules and decisions without the anger that marked our early separation, supporting each other's parenting even when we disagreed about details. His fiancé was kind to our daughter, and I was dating someone who respected my career and independence. The life I built looked nothing like what Daniel demanded 3 years ago, when he handed me that list of ways to diminish myself. I chose independence and self-respect over a marriage that required me to become smaller, quieter, less ambitious, less myself. That choice gave my daughter a mother who showed her that women don't have to sacrifice their identity to be worthy of love. And family, that leaving an unhealthy situation is strength rather than failure, that building a life on your own terms is possible even when it's hard.